Questions, comments, inserting perspective. So let's do that. Does anybody want to lead? Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you for speaking. You mentioned that neoliberalism, it seems to be like a very defining, like so pervasive in our generation. Why is it so ill-defined and so little known? Is it sort of like the Fight Club where rule number one is you don't talk about it? No.
Mm-hmm. The police department.
That's a great question, and I bet there are people in this room with opinions. I'll just suggest that I think American exceptionalism plays a huge role here. The idea that structural adjustment, right, has come home to roost, that the economic policies and kind of hard-right political governing model that the United States and other countries have supported throughout the global South now for decades has come home to roost in the United States. Is hard for folks in the United States to imagine. First of all, our population is not very literate about what happens in the rest of the world. And so these are not trend lines that are obvious to most folks in the United States, and certainly our press corps doesn't report very much on what happens outside our borders unless there's a war or there are a pogrom or vital U.S. economic interests somehow threatened. So I think that's part of it. But I also think it's been a slow boil in the U.S. I think it's been a slow boil. But I'm interested in hearing what other people think.
And just one other thing, the end of the Cold War. I mean, so capitalism is represented as uncontested now. It's dominant. There are no other alternatives. They've been defeated. Fukuyama says,
End of history.
The end of history. So I think on some level there's a way in which it's just been accepted as a fait accompli.
But to me, here we're in the middle of a debate between socialism and capitalism. In the Democratic Party. Actually, my concern. With Jean's comments about sort of neoliberalism undergirds the triumph of capitalism, but it's late stage capitalism. What it really is, it's not the triumph of capitalism. When you talk about the late stage of a society, it's a society that begs for another system. And I think that the debate we're having. To me, so Hillary Clinton is a neoliberal. She's a person who embraces, let's all win, let's make this thing whole. She defends her relationship with Goldman Sachs. The Clinton family played a major role in terms of dismantling the regulatory structure that really protected, the mainstream of society. And Bernie Sanders, so he's 75, he's like the rest of us who founded Crossroads. Old, but he's advancing a systemic challenge, which is really resonating. So to me, it's really a rich discussion at this point. I think the problem with neoliberalism is just that many times it's been masked and sort of intellectual and overly academic kinds of framework, but it's now a very current issue. So to me, the challenge about neoliberalism is not just opposing its excesses. That goes with the declining system. The question is, what alternative do you offer that's comprehensive and that's compelling? And so now the competition is between a neo-fascist like Trump, who's embracing Donald Duke and so on and so forth, and offering an alternative that also, but to me the debate here is, how do we feel about the current election? How do we feel about Hillary Clinton? What is going to be our role and our stance? In this current political debate, and it's very real, it's very concrete, and it's being debated.
I'm sorry, this actually doesn't have much to do with your comment, but it does go back to the term you used in terms of a literate populace. And are there any other words that can be used to describe this other than neoliberalism, something that's more intuitive? Because I have to say, I noticed that when we went from global warming to climate change, people stopped arguing about it as much because climate change was much more intuitive to people, even though weather patterns don't have necessarily as much to do with overall climate change. People could tell weather patterns were changing. So the fact that something was changing makes sense, whereas global warming, when it's 0 degrees in Chicago, it was hard for people to grasp the concept. And so I'm wondering, in terms of talking about some of these theories, as a way to find language that is that's more intuitive and fewer syllables.
Could you work on that?
NPR has many strengths. I'm not sure that sort of messaging to the masses we've ever been tagged with that being one of them. But I will say this is part of why I tried to focus on these notions of austerity, privatization, right, and so forth, because I think those are more tangible. Now, whether as a capsule phrase something like structural adjustment works or not, I don't know. But I do think that staying away from, I appreciate your point, that staying away from neoliberalism, which just raises all this confusing, references and baggage is.
I would just say capitalism.
Yeah. Let's get some other. Carl, go ahead, Carl.
I mean, I would argue, and I'll take it over to Dan's point too, that in fact, the movements that have been successful in recent years in capturing the public attention actually have already done that, brought their own terminology. I mean, if you look at what my union did with Republic Windows and Doors and popularizing the idea of the banks got bailed out, we got sold out, that hit just at the right moment, which then put the seedbed there for Occupy, which exposed inequality and it was helped by, at the same time, SEIU starting up their whole fight for a fair economy thing, which focused on the same thing and the power of the banks and finance capital, but not talking about finance capital, but we know that's what it is. But I think it's there, and I think it's why I'm actually a little concerned that we're a little too negative about the current political trends, because obviously it's very scary to see the language that Trump is using and how that's inspiring a section of the population. But we shouldn't be surprised, because the left got destroyed in the McCarthy era, and although there were other pieces that survived, there was never anything that really structurally was able to be attractive to the working class in large sections of the country. So as they got eventually destroyed, it's not economically, it's not surprising that they'd fall for a demagogue. But the fact is, we do have a lot of people now seriously questioning what's wrong with the capitalist system. And even Trump is basically using that same terminology. I mean, I think it's actually what I asked Tarso before we started, who is the ultra-right at this point? Is it Trump, or is it the people in the Republican Party who are opposed to Trump? I mean, and it's a serious question for us. And not to say that Trump is our ally whatsoever. Don't get me wrong, right? But understanding that there's powers that be who also are afraid of him, because, what he's advocating, whether he carry it out when he gets there or not, we don't know. But we also know Hillary won't carry out most of what she's saying either. But what he's advocating is, pardon?
Nor will Bernie.
Well, Bernie won't have the opportunity to in the same way anyway, because he'd have the limits of Congress on him. But some of the things he's talking about in terms of reducing America's military adventurism, for example. I mean, there's big pieces of capital that don't like that idea that they're not going to be able to keep those military production facilities going and making big money for that section of the ruling class, for example. So I think we've got opportunities here at the same time that there's a lot of danger.
Yeah, so I'd like to thank the organizers and, of course, you for sharing the information, because it's really valuable. And for a community organizer like me, it's like, well, how do you make it accessible to your community, to your point, of course. And it's like, how do you eat an elephant, or how do you eat the whole tree, right? At some point, you have to poke at some place and start, right? Now, you do a lot of research, and I would assume that there has been some kind of research around strategies of breaking them down so that it become manageable, chewable parts for organizers like us, and we take on what we could take and start from there. And then our role, since we're from different parts of the country doing different kinds of work, that our role will be to connect the dots. But for us to have access to something that we could chew on and start with, where would we go for that? Or how do we even begin to do something like that?
Great question. So, should I respond, or so one possibility is I respond, another possibility is we get a couple more questions out on the floor?
Okay,
No?
some more questions.
I really want to make sure we get to that.
Okay,
though,
well,
too.
I'll just jump,
Yeah,
I'll just jump
No,
in now.
no, but with,
Okay.
you know.
Yes.
And I'll be the monitor of it.
Okay,
Thank you.
feet to the fire.
Well, I'll give you a chunk that I'm dealing with right now, and I want to build on the question of narrative, because I think you did a nice job of giving us 4 structural columns that we can talk about. I think the school-to-prison pipeline has had some legs in not just the Black Lives Matter community, but I see it being talked about across the board more and more. I'm a folklorist. It's my profession to study belief systems and how people construct narratives. And what is terrifying to me is how successful both the neoliberals and Trump are at constructing narratives that get people to follow them. And I think that's our biggest challenge, and it's been our biggest challenge for a long time. And neoliberalism is both syllable and just, it's too confusing, a narrative. And the issue I'm dealing with personally right now is I live in Indiana, and I'm an advocate for Planned Parenthood. And we have a bill in the legislature right now that is under the guise of protecting women. Okay? This is how they're going to protect women in Indiana. If you have a non-viable fetus, you will not be allowed to have an abortion. You must deliver that fetus. That is part of the bill in the legislature right now. And I will tell you that it has been incredibly difficult for me to get folks to the level of hysteria I think they need to be at in terms of action on that bill. It's just so difficult because the language that's being used is seductive. It's being used in a way that sounds like they're protective of women. And it's a very clever strategy, and I think you're right. And it feels like that one elephant is overwhelming me right now. I cannot figure out how to get around it.
Go ahead, Renee.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I want to raise my critique to both the critique of the right and the left. Obviously, neoliberalism. Those of us with disabilities can easily understand the issues of austerity. The issues of deregulation, maybe we don't understand because many disabled people are becoming more regulated in their lives, kind of going back to the 60s idea of regulation of the poor. Privatization is impacting the disability community because instead of the state-owned Medicare, Medicaid programs now, we're running into privatization where, you know, you have the managed care corporations running it. Okay, authoritarianism, obviously, where disabled people are very marginalized in society. You become disabled, your voice will no longer be heard. But from the left perspective, too, I feel a critique. The left is focused on working class, on unions, on the poor, but they become abstractions. We're not talking about real people. Disabled people, anybody can have a disability at any time. We don't construct an economy that really is effective for all of us. Capitalism doesn't. We know that. Because it's based on competition. It's based on winners and losers. That's what competition is about. Capitalism, by definition, is going to require some inequality. You know, you're going to have measurements of great wealth and income, and then the concentrations of poor people. And disabled people are among the poorest of the poor. Well, whenever we talk about disabled people, we talk about them in abstract terms. We talk about poor people in abstract terms. And the left, I think, is very complicit in that, unfortunately. We don't talk to people. And anybody can become disabled. My mother is now 80-something years old. She can barely hear. She doesn't want to admit it. Right? Who wants to admit it? I was 21 when I became disabled, and I was working in the steel mills. My grandfather was working in the steel unions, and I was working in the steel mills. I'm a union guy, but you try to get the unions and the left to try to listen to us, and they won't. So my problem today is, how do we begin to build economic and political power within communities of people who have been really disenfranchised and marginalized in real terms, not just in any abstract terms that we put measurements around them or whatever. But there are many people, and disability crosses race, genders, gender identity, sexual orientation, what have you. So how do we bring our communities together? And that's what I'm struggling with. How do we bring people together around this massive issue of concentration of capitalism? That's the elephant in the room.
There are a lot of elephants.
First of all, I want to thank you all for the softball questions. So a few thoughts. I'm not sure they're answers, but a few thoughts on the issues that the last three folks to speak have brought up. One is, I think that one of the more pernicious manifestations of the power that the right has accrued has been actually the slow boil, right, around women's rights and bodily autonomy. To the point where...
as much as
Oh,
possible.
I'm sorry. I've been up since 3:30 this morning, and so I may be beginning to fade a little bit. I've seldom criticized for being a low talker. I'll do my best here. I think one of the more pernicious manifestations of the power that the right's accrued of these last decades has been the attacks on women's bodily autonomy, right? That have become so normalized now that we're really talking in many cases about criminalization, right? Despite the inability so far to overturn Roe, the de facto, being back to pre-Roe levels of access, but worse than that, the criminalization, the jailing of women, right? So that, in a variety of strategies to achieve it. And so I think that, wherever we go and we talk about these issues, there's a sense of despair and defeatism that this is third rail politics. And so even people who feel committed to it politically feel like there's just no traction. So I do take some heart from folks who are really trying to figure this out in terms of rebuilding the infrastructure of the women's movement with respect to reproductive justice and taking a fresh look and thinking about whether we need a different set of institutions. I think that's going to be a long build, right? I think that's going to be a long build to turn that around. And I think that with respect to some of the issues that, is it Angela, you were raising, and maybe also weaving them a bit with what Carl was bringing up about not getting too cynical, about this moment. I actually think that there is a tremendous danger and tremendous opportunity in this moment, right? So just a couple of thoughts about the opportunity that I think relate to your question. One of the things that's happened with the level of precariousness, right, of the economy and of employment is that people's expectations, especially a younger generation, younger than me mostly, generation of folks, is fundamentally different. The shiny baubles, the notion that somehow this society is going to take care of you, it's like the veil is off that promise for multitudes, right, in this society. And I think that there is a radical potential in that, and we're seeing that. We're seeing that radical potential in a variety of different organizing manifestations, from Occupy to the Black Lives Matter movement, and a lot of other things to boot. And so one of the things I see in that is a real hunger for political education, for real political, deep political discourse, in a way that was much harder in my generation. Like these kids who were being raised, under Reagan, where it was not cool, it was not socially, hip, it was none of these things. It was a slog. There's a hunger for that kind of engagement, and I think a need in this moment for a million Bakers, right? That connective tissue between folks who've been in this work for a long time, who don't try to direct what a younger generation is doing, but find ways to leverage resources. to make that happen. And there's some great examples of that happening right now, and not enough of them, actually. So I think that there is some real potential there. And I actually think that there is, in some cases, a greater literacy around certain kinds of problems in that younger generation than folks who are a little bit older, and then some real gaps as well. So there are some, I think, very accessible pieces. And there are folks, so whether it's, the most accessible thing PRA has produced on this is actually this issue that has very short, concise pieces looking at a variety of different issues around neoliberalism. But there are folks who are doing great, popular education around economic literacy, whether it's United for a Fair Economy, a variety of other projects around the country. So there are curricular materials that I think are available to accomplish some of the things that you were asking about, Angela. I think with respect to some of the is it Renee? Issues that Renee was raising, and you raised a lot of issues here. I think, first of all, we don't really have a left, in my opinion, in the United States. It's part of one of Carl's observations. Our infrastructure is really weak, right? So there's tremendous opportunity, and there's a lot that needs to get built or rebuilt or built differently from how it's been in the past. I actually think that, and I'm curious what your experience has been, Renee. I actually think, again, part of my hope comes from a younger generation that actually is much more literate and open to understanding the intersections of these different lived experiences, where disability overlays with feminism and where it overlays with economic justice and injustice. I actually think there's a greater facility to engage some of those questions among young people, even though there are also real challenges. There are real struggles that exist. I know that work that I really admire, work that the National Domestic Workers Association has done, has also at times come into tension with disability rights organizers. But at least that's something that is negotiable. It's there. It's on the surface. It can get worked out. So I'm actually in a way optimistic about some of that. What disheartens me is I think that the sense that we are in some cases just overwhelmed with the attacks. I mean, I think that with the attacks, and not to over focus on Trump, because as my brother rightly points out, pick your poison. There are an array of threats here in the political sphere that would bring a variety of different, variations of the problems that we would have to address depending on who's elected. But I do think that for some, as much as there's animated work that's happening in the streets, for some there's kind of a deer in the this extended deer in the headlights moment. This kind of extended moment of disbelief that this somehow is a bad dream, that it can't be happening. I think that is dangerous. I think that's dangerous.
I also think it's very generational in a way, because I was just at a talk yesterday delivered by a young woman, brilliant young woman from the Black Youth Project 100, who had a very sophisticated analysis. So I really agree with Tarso. I think that there is a lot happening, a lot of analysis that is very intersectional, looking at class, race, ability, all of these things together. And I'm not saying that they're leaving, the old left behind, but I do think that this is happening, maybe almost a parallel world. There's this critique of what's going on. In terms of the left and whether or not it's dead or not, I think it sort of depends on what the left is now, because I do think that I don't know if we want to even call it the new left. I'm not really sure how to sort of describe what's happening, but there is a movement brewing, and but it is a long kind of process. But I'm hopeful for that reason, at the same time that, this seems like the worst time ever, in terms of the future. But, you're talking about the Black Lives people, the Occupy people. I mean, we can even add the do-it-yourself, DIY, which sounds completely apolitical, but it's actually, I think, a real reflection of disaffected young people on the one hand, but also folks just saying, okay, we have to do things for ourselves, and in a way that could be, very radicalizing or not. You know, it could be, you know, hipsters just trying to be the next capitalist class. So, but there is a lot happening, you know, today. And this woman was really amazing, just weaving in prisons and, you know, racism and the, you know, the real critique of the Democratic Party as well as, you know, the Republican Party and the right. Yeah, that was hopeful. Yeah, her name is Charlene Carruthers, and she's the president of the BYP 100 right now, or director.
So on that note, I'm going to kind of thank you for that. And
But
you
there are a
know,
lot of those.
Yeah, and you know, BYP 100 is a grantee of the Crossroads Fund, as are many of the other groups that are really sort of exploring these issues of intersectionality. You mentioned connective tissue. I just want to thank you guys for being here today as the continuation of the connective tissue. Lynette and Tarso, thank you so much for your we came here because Jean is the connective tissue that helped to create these two organizations, which I know Tarso and I really feel that that's a connection we want to keep going. These kinds of discussions we want to keep going, and so we can commit that we'll try to figure that out every now and again. Again, thank you all for your participation. Let's think of Jean. I know I do all the time. Let's especially think of her today and tomorrow and the rest of our week when we're trying to figure out how do we approach these issues, how do we tackle some of these concerns in our lives, and how do we work together? Because that idea of how we create together and work together and brainstorm together and, you know, to use an old phrase, struggle together to figure out the solution. So that's what we're here about, to continue that work that Jean helped start with all of us. So thank you again. Eat the food.